Welcome to How to Win At. You know how to play, now it's time to win. Today we're going to help you get back at your dad for giving you a stupid name by tackling a personal favorite of mine that's not as well known as I think it should be. Spheres of Influence, the struggle for global supremacy. Before we begin, there's some basic terminology I'm going to be using throughout the video, so I want to get that down at the start so there's no confusion. First is your winning faction. This refers to the faction that you believe is going to have the most spheres and capitals at the end of the game and win it for you. Generally speaking, you will make this choice several turns into the game, though sometimes it may seem obvious right after setup. We can see in our example here that purple has 3 spheres and some outlying territory, putting them in a very strong position to win the game. Your disruptor is a faction with very little shot of actually winning, but can be sacrificed to break up the spheres of your opponent's winning faction. Our red friend here in Australia doesn't even control 2 spheres, so they'll likely attack another winning faction to give their player the best chance of winning. Final borders are the borders of your winning faction's spheres. Your winning faction can hold territory outside of its final borders, but the final borders are what must be defended if you are going to win with that faction. Notice how the West Chinese territory is not included here, because it can be lost in the final round without losing any spheres. A lot of the strategies and tactics we discuss here will sound very hard and fast, like ironclad rules. This is not how you play Spheres of Influence. This is a game about flexibility, about making plans, about being able to change them in response to your opponent's actions. As Moti the Elder said, strategy is no more than the expedient which a Feldherr uses to advance his objectives amidst the confusion of war. Versatility is tremendously important in Spheres of Influence because of how few moves you ever get to make. So always keep that in mind, and remember, nothing said here is set in stone. The number of players is going to affect your strategy and the general flow of the game drastically, so we're going to talk about the specifics behind each player count separately. There are big differences between the 2-player, 3 to 4-player, and 5 to 8-player versions of the game, covering everything from setup strategy to how the board develops and the expected number of winning spheres. Before we dive into the nuances created by different numbers of players, however, there are several general tips for playing Spheres of Influence that apply across all versions of the game. To start, the cards you draw to choose your original capitals aren't just options for you, but give you information about your opponents. How? If you drew an original capital card, it means no one else did, so you know that nobody will deploy in the capital you didn't choose, meaning if you draw 2 capital cards that are adjacent, the one you do pick has a guaranteed sphere to expand into. If that seems too wordy, don't worry, we're going to use an example. For instance, our friend Catherine here has been dealt Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. Now, Catherine's usually tentative to pick D.C. because far too often she's been screwed over by an aggressive Mexico with a lucky first turn, taking her Texan oil and cutting off the west coast. But because we know Mexico City is empty, there is no immediate threat to Catherine's oil. We can go one step further, as this information also extends to the next pair of capital cards you draw, giving you even more information to work with. For example, India and China are very strong original capitals if the other is empty. So if you discarded one of them in your previous hand of capitals, you know for a fact that the other is open and safe to deploy in. This same idea strengthens Western Europe. If you know North Africa or Northern Europe is unclaimed, you have much easier access to the oil fields that the Europeans so desperately need. This should also affect your decisions to deploy in the Americas or Africa by giving you a basic metric of how crowded they're going to be, as adding too many factions to these places can change a relaxed march across the continent to a grimy basement knife fight in no time. It's worth saying at this point that you have another source of information on your opposing faction's locations, that is, the other players themselves. I'm not saying to interrogate them and ask questions, as this will likely reveal more about your own position than you can ever get out of them. But if you've played with these people before or talked about the game with them, then you might have some insight into how they pick. Previous games can also be a treasure trove of information. A player who got screwed last game by a lack of oil may consider the Middle East or North Africa more strongly than normal. This tip is as useful as you want to make it, and can become a game in and of itself for the psychoanalysts among you, but never rely on it too heavily, because it always comes down to the cards that they've been dealt. Another key consideration when deciding your original capitals, and where to expand once the game begins, is the resources available. The general rule is to have a balance of production and oil, especially in the early game. However, this changes slightly depending on whether the faction in question is on track to become a winning faction, who favor production, or a disruptor faction, who favor oil. After we leave the setup phase, you'll find there are a lot less concrete strategies to go off of. While it is obviously important to play optimally and move your units as efficiently as possible to grow quickly and win battles, the part of the game where you're actually playing it leaves little in the way of strict doctrine. This doesn't mean, however, that there aren't strategies that you can use to improve your play and build strong factions. A good place to start is generally knowing what you're going to do with every unit you deploy. This doesn't require a massive plan, but I like to split my units up during the mobilization phase based on either where they're going or how I want to use them. For example, let's check back in with Catherine, who's found herself with a hostile border on one side and room to expand on the other. She has 8 units to deploy and needs to figure out what to do with them. While she knows her neighbor to the south, Charlie, isn't afraid of taking a fight, but he won't throw his whole army away for an unlikely victory. Catherine will feel comfortable with 5 units protecting Mexico City, so she makes a separate pile with them and sets them off to one side. After that, she decides where she wants to expand into with her remaining units. This method helps reduce cognitive load and zero in what you're actually trying to accomplish with your turn. And speaking of cognitive load, put a little math in your game. Put a little math in your game. The ratio of production to units is very simple, and a good thing to keep in mind as you expand. How many units you can deploy, not counting original capitals and spheres controlled, is your production divided by 3 rounded down plus 1. This means for every 3 production you gain, that's another unit you get next turn. This ratio is important when considering if you should secure a sphere early in the game or take a more resource-rich territory. If the new territory is worth 3 or more production, or at least enough to bump you up to another unit with some additional benefits, then it's often worth it to secure the sphere next turn. If this is too much to keep in your head, just keep an eye on the production tracker and make a note of the next number that gets you another unit. This is a good way to decide whether to take a lower production territory with a special card, or the higher production territory with that one. If the sphere you're looking to get is threatened, however, then the calculus changes, as you never want to be forced into attacking anything because of defender's advantage, especially in the early game. On the subject of oil, it may seem like you should try and get as much of it as quickly as possible, and by the mid to late game this is absolutely true. But when you're still expanding and taking more land, it's worth considering you can only take as much territory as you have available units. Considering many of the oil fields have very low production, it's worth considering whether you're going to end up with turns to play but no troops to move. A unit that isn't moved still has value. It can be moved later, or fight in a battle, or just exist and exert pressure on your neighbors, taunting them with the prospect of once more rolling the fabled special dice. But a turn not taken is worthless. I'm making this sound like a much more common problem than it is, but it's a good thing to be aware of so it doesn't happen to you. And just because a unit exists doesn't mean it can be safely moved. It's very likely on turns 2 and 3 that you'll have enough units to use all your turn cards and then some, assuming you don't need them to protect something. Now, if the oil can be taken by another player, especially one who really needs it like our friendly neighborhood Germans, then the prudent move may be to take it because the long-term value of denying your opponent those moves is greater than squeezing out one more unit. Like all things in spheres of influence, the key is to stay flexible and remain aware of the changing situation. As long as you avoid getting turns beyond your means of production, however, I've found it's better to start oil rich and expand quickly into productive territories than the other way around. However, this is a very general statement for a game with a lot of possibilities, and the more crowded your starting location, the more valuable production is early on to make sure you aren't just overrun at the beginning of the game. This gets into the ultimate problem that you have to solve when you play Spheres of Influence, and that's finding the balance between efficiently expanding and checking your neighbor's ambitions. You can basically solve what your optimal moves are to get the most resources as quickly as possible, but the actual game part comes in when you consider the other players. What specifically you do depends on the number of players, who they are, how they play, where they're set up, but something must be done about them, simply because you can't win the game if someone else does. On that note, we're going to talk about combat. You likely already understand the basics like concentrate your units and that it's better to defend than attack because of the special dice. We can go deeper. I've calculated the probability of how many kills and hits should occur from each round of combat depending on how many dice are rolled, accounting for different numbers of special dice on each side as well. For those interested, I've put a spreadsheet in the description down below, which I heartily encourage you to check out, especially if you're like me and trust your dice less than an election year campaign promise. All the information you need is on the summary sheets. The rest of them are just there if you want to check my work. And to the one person who's willing to fact check nearly 10,000 lines of a spreadsheet full of hypothetical dice rolls, please email me, because I have some data entry that needs doing, and you must have an inhuman resistance to boredom. Take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. Not that my math is wrong, but because what I'm about to say isn't everything there is to combat in Spheres of Influence. But in terms of killing potential, each special die shifts the balance of power one unit towards the side that benefits from it. It's kind of confusing, so I'll give an example. Let's say we have 3 units attacking from a sea zone onto the land, giving the defender 2 special dice. Those 3 units have a similar probability to kill something in 1 round of combat as the 1 unit they are attacking that has 2 special dice. Obviously, the 3 attackers can take more casualties before they lose, so it's not a perfect comparison, but I think it's a good thing to keep in mind, especially when you consider you can only roll 5 dice at a time, so large attacking forces don't always fight quite as hard as you might think that they should. On a related point, my interpretation of the data suggests special dice are more useful when blocking if you're rolling large numbers of dice, but as you lose units, they have a greater impact when scoring extra kills. Even though casualties do become more important as you lose units, it's something to keep in mind when you play a card like Special Forces. Speaking of, special cards add an interesting layer of risk, reward, and value assessment to the game because they require you to judge the importance of your moves in battles. Generally speaking, it's good to save your special cards, especially the powerful combat ones, for the end of the game where every battle could decide the victor. But there are some caveats, and flexibility is always important. The first exception is cards that support rapid expansion, especially those like Conversion, which may become literally unplayable as the board fills up. Research and Revolution are also generally played immediately, but there's absolutely an argument to be made for holding on to them until you have a better idea of what you need, like a Discover effect in Hearthstone. The same goes for Diplomacy, assuming you're not too selfish to play it at all. But generally, I believe the strongest part about the special cards in your hand is that your opponents don't know what they are, and therefore what you're capable of. It's for this reason that I don't like to use special cards for special dice or units unless the card is utterly useless or it's a game-deciding situation. I might not be the mayor of Value Town, but I like to visit, and using special cards in this way often feels like a waste. Because in the right circumstances, these cards can be crazy strong. I've won and lost countless games because of a last-minute special card disrupting a sphere or winning an unlikely battle. There's a very particular kind of schadenfreude derived from rocket firing a sphere away on the last turn of the game, or taking a crucial territory in the penultimate round and playing Ceasefire to deny someone their game-winning sphere. This doesn't mean they should be exclusively saved for this purpose, however. It's up to your personal judgment and read on the game to determine when special cards should be used. Take it from me, it's a terrible feeling to lose a game with a handful of special cards that might have made the difference earlier. We're not going to go through all the special cards in detail in this video because most of them are either incredibly obvious as to when they should be used or so broadly applicable that there isn't anything meaningful I can say about them. I think they're generally well balanced, some allow for really crazy stuff, but they all have their moments where they can demolish a strategy if your opponent's not ready for them. Okay, fine, we'll talk about Nuke. At first glance, nuclear missile kills lots of guys. Everyone, in fact, that happens to be in the territory that got nuked. It also prevents anyone from entering that territory for the rest of the round, meaning you shouldn't nuke anything you want to own anytime soon. These effects alone might not always be worth the 3 special cards you have to pay for them, but together they can be brutally game-changing. This is a real story from a game I played recently. The original capital of my winning faction was in Ankara, and a massive army was arrayed against me in Iraq. It came down to the turn cards. I got lucky and nuked him before he could invade, erasing his forces and that faction's chance of victory. The risk you run in using the nuke card, however, is the chance of being intercepted, which is one of the worst feelings in Spheres of Influence. I know this because I asked my friend from the previous story, because I didn't actually get the first turn in that game. My friend and his 6 turn cards had my European faction beat easily in the oil game and tried to nuke Ankara first, but I stopped him with the intercept card that I had literally been holding on to since turn 2. This leads into a discussion of how strong intercept is, and whether to save it specifically for nukes or use them earlier for other cards, and this is why I'm not going over any more special cards, because they are so interconnected, and you can't talk about one without bringing up another, and there is far too much script left. We gotta move on. The heart of the strategy around actually winning Spheres of Influence is that it's a lot easier to break a sphere than to score it. If you get one takeaway from this video, make sure that's it. Taking the right 3 territories, which in many cases are next to each other, can kick a 3-sphere lead to dead last. This is why your disruptor factions want oil. It doesn't matter how big your army is if it never gets to the critical battle you need to break your opponent's spheres. This is where the shapes of the spheres, the territories that make them up, and their borders come into play. If you really examine the board, you can find lots of interesting little situations that you can turn to your strategic advantage. For example, the Indian side of the India-Middle East border is much stronger and easier to defend than the Middle Eastern side. Why? Because the Indian side only has to hold Pakistan. They can concentrate their forces there to attack or defend. but the Middle East has to choose between concentrating in Iran to protect the rest of the Middle East against India and the Central Asian sphere, abandoning Afghanistan, or splitting their forces between the two and risk getting overwhelmed by a concentrated single force. You should consider this when deciding on your final borders, because the fewer territories you have to garrison, the stronger the defenses of each territory will be. To put it into numbers, let's say you have 12 units to deploy going on to the final round, which is fairly common for your winning faction. If your final borders are made up of 6 territories, you can only add 2 per territory, leaving only 3 units to defend for the final round. If you can make this 4 territories, then that's an extra unit in every army, which can really make a big difference. How your factions look when you win the game is largely determined by the number of factions and players, but there is a strategy useful enough in 2 to 4 player games that it's worth being aware of, namely annexing your own territory. Annexing is an interesting mechanic, because you use up a turn and at least 1 unit without making your collective self any stronger. It only comes into play for the victory condition. In short, it's a risky move that can be game winning at the right time and a crippling blunder at the wrong time. I generally avoid annexing my other faction's territories, but I've seen it be done to great effect in some very close games. My last general tip before diving into the specifics based on the number of players is true of any board game, and it's to know the other people at the table. Someone's personality in previous games will affect how they play and what actions they take. There's a certain type of person who won't attack your original capital on the first or even second turn just because they don't like knocking people out of the game and being overly aggressive. Some players are the exact opposite, and are possibly the reason you're watching this video, looking to cripple you as quickly as possible and barely leave you with any game to play at all. Some players calculate the odds on their attacks, printed out the spreadsheet in the description, and will only strike when they have a high chance of victory with special cards in reserve. Others think rolling dice is fun, and will take one-on-one battles all day long because they have nothing better to do with their turn. Understanding your opponents won't give you precognition, but it's helpful to understand why someone plays if you want to anticipate their strategy. Some players like to take this a step further and talk the other people at the table into or out of different moves. Different groups have different feelings about this, and it's important to know what kind you're in. For some, table talk of any kind is straight up manipulation and is heavily frowned upon. For others, it's the entire point of the game. I personally believe it really depends on the group and the game, but to me, the diplomatic aspect of Spheres of Influence is one of its best features. But at the end of the day, there is no game without people to play it, so use your best judgment and don't go against the group's general vibe. And if you really need a competitive reason to not agitate the people you play games with, consider that if you tick someone off hard enough, they might just spend the whole game making sure you lose. We'll touch on the importance of making sure that doesn't happen and trust in general when we discuss the versions with more players, but for now, just don't be that guy. The 2-player version of the game is the only one where any players control more than 2 factions, which is a much bigger deal than it may seem at first. The same general strategy will apply whether you're playing with 3 or 4 factions per player. More factions just increases the odds you'll be able to pull off the kind of combos that makes me reluctant to play Spheres of Influence as a 2-player wargame. Your strategic thinking should begin during setup when you're first dealt your choices for original capitals. The name of the game in 2-player Spheres is Adjacent Factions. With 3 or 4 factions under your command, the odds are very good that at least 2 of them will be either adjacent or only have 1 sphere between them. Obviously, this isn't required to win a 2-player game, but it is very helpful because every border you share with a friendly faction is at least 2 territories that don't have to be defended, and oftentimes many more. This accelerates expansion and makes protecting your winning factions and final borders in the late game much easier. You should try and have as many of your factions as close to each other as possible, as long as they don't interfere with each other's expansions and collection of spheres. A good rule of thumb is, as you select your original capitals, make sure each faction has 2 or 3 easy spheres to expand into. These may be contained by your opponent's deployment, but it leaves room to maneuver and grow before having to break your way out. Remember our lesson from earlier about how you know your opponent can't start in capitals you've discarded? Pepperidge Farm remembers, and so will your opponent if they're a particularly savvy player. Your ultimate goal is to have as much of your winning faction's final borders protected by friendly territory as possible. This means your opponent will have to expend their units and resources before they even hit your winning faction. Keep this goal in mind as you deploy your original capitals and play the game in the 2-player version. Now that you've chosen your capitals, the board is set, and you see your opponent's forces for the first time. You should have a rough estimate of how far your factions can expand before they meet your opponent's factions, but keep in mind you don't really know what they're going to do. Stay flexible. As a general rule, you should take territories that are at risk of being taken by your opponent before taking safe land that your opponent will have a much harder time getting to, unless there is a profound benefit in taking the safer areas first, such as much higher production or your only available oil. You want to do this because everyone starts out with so few units and turns are so often needed for expansion. It's rare that someone will attack territory you control in the early game unless they have a clear advantage or there is a massive payoff to winning that battle, such as taking an original capital or a very strong territory. The two-player version most allows you to develop an overall plan that you can actually stick to, because you only need to consider and understand one other person. This doesn't mean go full Schlieffen, but there's a lot less chaos on the strategic level when only 2 players are involved. The winning faction in a 2-player game will generally have 3 spheres under their control, though 2-sphere victories aren't super rare. This means you should shoot for your winning factions to enter the last round with at least 3, maybe even 4 spheres, and ideally its borders should have some degree of defenses already. I generally spend my mobilization phase fortifying my winning faction in a 2-player game, and while that's usually the best move, again, you should never deploy units without having some idea of what they're there for. I have the most experience with the 3 to 4 player version of the game. Spheres of Influence becomes much more dependent on diplomacy and creating generally strong factions with 3 to 4 players than the more specific, gimmicky tactics we outlined when discussing the 2-player game. Your winning faction is generally going to be winning with 2, maybe 3 spheres. So, like in the previous version, if you can have a strong 3-sphere faction as your winning faction, you can afford to lose one in the late game, and if you have enough capitals, you'll have a good shot at coming out on top. Again, it varies. It's worth mentioning at this point that you shouldn't be too hard on yourself for losing as you add more players. Once you include more than 2 people, you should be losing more often just because of the sheer force of probability. If you have 4 players and only 1 can win, that's a 75% chance you're not going to be them. Especially for those of you coming primarily from video games or 2-player games, the idea that it makes statistical sense for you to lose can often be hard to get your head around. But back to the game. The other key change that occurs as more players are added is your decreasing control over what happens in the game. However, we can get a lot of mileage out of the old Serenity prayer, most specifically the wisdom part, or insight if you're a truly devout follower of Niebuhr. We'll save the semantic debates for Twitter and move on. Most of my previous advice still stands, but carries an important caveat that is essential to keep in mind. Make sure the table isn't afraid of you. It doesn't matter how strong your factions are. The nature of Spheres of Influence means that you will almost certainly lose a game if all the other players decide you must be dealt with and act on it, especially in the early game. It's hard to say anything conclusive about how to avoid this because it's highly dependent on who you play with. Some groups consider 2 adjacent factions to be a significant advantage and will focus you down from the start if you begin with them. Others either lack the will or ability to coordinate on that level. It really comes down to the specifics of the other players and reading the table. Because the outcome of multiplayer games is so dependent on the other players, the rest of this video will be a guide on diplomacy in Spheres of Influence. If you've been taking everything I've said so far with a grain of salt, it might be time to add a few more shakes, because while these tips are from many dozens of games of Spheres, they have been played against a grand total of 7 other people, which isn't the best sample size. And if you're looking for help with a 5 to 8 player game of Spheres, then you may as well dump the shaker on my head, because I've never played it. That doesn't mean my suggestions won't help, but telling you to build a balanced faction that slightly favors production over oil isn't coming from specific experience with one faction games, it's just an assumption. The goal of diplomacy is, at its core, to conserve resources. Obviously, not attacking someone saves you the turn you use to move your forces and whatever units would be lost in the fight, but we can do much better. One great thing you can do is agree to peaceful borders. There are a couple ways you can accomplish this depending on how much you trust the other player. The simplest way is to declare your intentions, or lack thereof, regarding each other's borders.
Are you going to attack me?
No. Are you going to attack me?
No.
Great. You can also go as far as establishing demilitarized zones to make betrayal harder. You have to accept that you're going to have to give something up to make a deal. The key is having other avenues to expand and keeping the terms of the truce limited. Maybe it's because I mostly play this game with other guys, but I've found my opponents are usually afraid of commitment. So short-term agreements are the best because people don't want to be stuck with something that might end up getting in their way later. This is also useful so you can win the game without being dishonest. I've found that, especially if you're playing with a regular group, honesty is very important. Taking aside the fact that these people may be your friends, or at the very least, people who you have to see semi-regularly who you don't want to hate you, it makes competitive sense to not go back on truce and alliance. If you betray someone, they're probably not going to make deals with you, which, as we've gone, non-aggression is generally the most efficient way to go about playing not only this game, but lots of other games. People will also remember that you betrayed them, and at best, they won't trust you for the next couple of games. At worst, they might start a gaming vendetta against you and try their hardest to make sure you always lose. Every single game. Fancy ideas aside, the best thing you can do is talk and be honest with these people. So that's Spheres of Influence. Thank you for watching, and remember, if you're going to play to win, play the long game.